Let's talk Targon. When Eclipse Dragon got buffed, I was very excited because it was my favorite card in Monument of Powers, but it wasn't very good. Since moving from a 7-5 to a 7-7, Targon, and especially Targon Allegiance, has slowly crept its way up tier lists until today, where it seems to very solidly command a tier 1 spot. But like a lot of other decks, there's a lot of personalization within the archetype that I'm going to give you a little overview of. Unlike the Mistwraith overview, this time I actually am going to give you a history lesson on the archetype because it's all very recent history and, in my opinion, valuable information. It's not going to be linear, so bear with me. But first I had mentioned Eclipse Dragon. Obviously the buff to that card is not the sole reason the deck is coming up big right now. The nerf to Wording Stone had a much larger impact, because if you look at Targon lists performing in tournaments, not all of them are running Eclipse Dragon. Those players are wrong. But the meta we were coming out of was not one that was very friendly to these value-style decks. When Call of the Mountain dropped, Leona Luxol was one of the best decks once the dust settled. And by Leona Luxol, I do mean all three of those champions in the same deck or any combination of the two. The decks were different, but the differences in those old lists aren't relevant to this point. No direct nerfs were ever issued to that style of deck. It fell off because Lee Sin was buffed. Not only did this take away your Targon options in Region Locked and Unified, but Targon Allegiance decks or Lux decks didn't do that well into Lee Sin or the meta that popped up around him of War Mother's Call and Twisted Fate Swain. You could hold your own, but it felt like you were making things unnecessarily hard on yourself. Targon decks started to pop up more and more after the Lee Sin nerf, but before the Wording Stone nerf, most often Leona Diana with Unspeakable Horror Splash. It's a meta progression we're not unfamiliar with. Feel the Rush is the scary deck, so aggro pops up to farm Feel the Rush, and Targon pops up to farm aggro. Now, with Feel the Rush gone, aggro is still abundant, but one of the major archetypes that you couldn't outvalue, Ramp, disappeared. Is Ramp dead? No. But it's not popular, and the progression of the meta doesn't indicate it's going to get popular anytime soon. So what you're left with is a very consistent anti-aggro value deck and very few decks who can outvalue you in the late game or kill you before you can use all of the value you've generated. On top of that, thanks to EU Masters, we've seen what players are willing to do to run the deck multiple times in a seasonal format tournament. While True Mono Targon is popular with both Leona Aesol and Leona Diana, you can't run Leona twice in the seasonal tournament. I know I mentioned Lux earlier, but single combat Concerted Strike feel pretty important, and Mountain Scryer is necessary to keep up versus other Mountain Scryer decks. So Lux adds a third Demacia card, but having played a lot of the deck, I can tell you right now that Remembrance feels like a pretty key piece to the Lux package. And so, we've seen players run their second Targon decks as Garen Aurelion Soul alongside Diana Leona. Judgment is a hell of a card, and Garen's Judgment means you don't have to commit additional non-allegiance spaces to run it. But right now, if you're running a Leona Targon deck, Mountain Scryer feels like the best version. If you want to splash a little Demacia, that's totally fine, but the majority of players have made the decision that Unspeakable Horror is not worth the possibility of missing a Mountain Scryer hit, as he is nearly objectively the most backbreaking Allegiance miss, as you're left with a 4-mana 2/3 whose continuous ability is further diminished by an Allegiance whiff. Now you're probably thinking, Boulevard, what does this mysterious Garen Aesol deck look like? And the problem is that none of the EU Masters players were willing to spill their secrets to me, and I don't know. I know it does look different from this, but I'm not sure how different, because you can't just swap the Leonas out for Garens, because you also need to cut Rahvun, because that card is nowhere near as good when you're not playing Leona, and then you probably have to cut down on single combat or Concerted Strike. I would think single combat, because you're losing out on Rahvun and Leona, which are some prime single combat targets, but honestly, I don't know, and I don't know the last 3 cards that you would replace it with, so I don't feel confident giving you that information. So instead we're going to focus on the 2 popular Leona decks of the format, because I'm not even convinced that double Targon is the way to go, especially if you have to shaft yourself into doing it and running things like Garen. It really does depend on what those Rahvun placements are. So the deck that we do have here is obviously all about Celestial Invocation. You've got the Solari Priestess as well as the Mountain Scryer, the triple Star Shaping, the triple Aurelion Soul, and that's really all you need. We've cut down on things like Guiding Touch, we've cut down on Behold the Infinite, we're not running Lunari Priestess. You don't have to jam every single card that says Invoke into your deck, you just need to have the right number, and honestly, the Invoke cards that you play do feel a little overcosted, and that's just how the mechanic works. The reason that the Celestials are so powerful is because they kind of tied the cost into the uselessness of the cards that generate them. Star Shaping is a hell of a tool in order to beat things like Back Alley Poker. The 5 damage to your face just gets healed up, keep your units alive, keep them away from pings. I don't hate the idea of running more guiding touches because things like Back Alley are going to be popular and they like to take your units down in increments. And it's similar with Ezreal Draven or any kind of Noxus Ezreal deck. They want to ping your unit once and then get an execute down onto it. So yeah, guiding touch is something that you could slide into a deck like this, but I do think that going for Behold the Infinite would be a little bit too much, although I don't honestly hate the idea of 1 to 2 copies just to be able to out Celestial your opponents, but I think that's going to come more down to just getting and sticking an Aesol rather than having more cards in your deck that actually generate the Celestials. Now previously there were decks like Feel the Rush that would kill you the turn that you got down your first Great Beyond because they had 2 massive Overwhelm units, and then they could go for Atrocity. And as you can see here, once you take 1 hit, you're basically dead to Atrocity because there's not a lot of removal. That is a major weakness of this archetype. There's not a lot of removal, and it's the reason that players are still going for Demacia over the Mono Targon build. They like having access to Concerted Strike in single combat, just a little bit of interaction. Yes, there is good Celestial removal, Supernova, Cosmic Rays, Falling Comet, Meteor Shower, but it's not consistent, and the deck is supposed to be consistent. So if you are expecting decks where you're going to need a fair amount of removal, yeah, go ahead, go for something like this. Sharp Sight isn't even out of the question if you think that your units aren't big enough for single combat to really make a difference, or you're just struggling with things like Zap Sprayfin. And then here we have the Mono Targon Diana Leona. It looks very different from the Kid Cudi decks that we were used to seeing that were Diana Leona. We cut Unspeakable Horror, we didn't go for sort of the early game Lunari Duskbringer payoffs like Lunari Shadestalker. Instead, we went for Eclipse Dragon, and Eclipse Dragon with the Dustpetal Dusk actually feels really good, especially if you have Rahvun on the field. The Eclipse Dragon buff really helped propel a deck like this into the limelight. Yeah, sure, you don't have Aurelion Soul to get down that turn 8 Aesol Eclipse Dragon combo that I am so fond of, but you do play better into aggro. You have a lot more early game agency. Your Diana is removal for primetime targets like Twisted Fate that traditionally Mono Targon have or even just Targon heavy decks have a very difficult time dealing with. Even if you look at Tom Raka, the only outs that you have for a Twisted Fate are Boxtopus and Tom Kench, and that's about it. Triple Hush comes in because you really don't have much interaction. Popping Spell Shields is a little relevant because of Sky's Descent, but not the most important thing in the world. As you can see, the unit lineup very similar to that we saw out of Leona Aesol because you are still a Leona deck. And then the Sky's Descent is actually really important as a mirror breaker. Generally, it's not the first player that levels Aesol because neither player is going to level Aesol, but sometimes it's just who finds 2 Aesol first, because you're generally finding yourself in these landlocked positions where you and your opponent, if you're playing a Targon mirror that is, both have the same board more or less, and you're trying to figure out what is the way that I break this, and the Skies Descend is that way. It's also great against any other deck in the format, really, because it's really difficult for your opponent to get through this large board that you amass with the Leona and Rahvun and that combo, because you're going to constantly throw down Daybreak units, stun out their units. This makes them commit more to the board, and that's why Judgment is also so good in a deck like this. Eventually, your opponent wants to go in for a full-on trade, or at least a partial trade. So what does the Mono Targon list do that the Demacia version does not do? The answer is pretty straightforward. Diana. Obviously, Lunari Duskbringer comboing with Eclipse Dragon is really cool, but at the end of the day, it really is just Diana. Do you value the early removal as well as 9 1-drops? It's really much more of an anti-aggro list. I do think in a straight-up head-to-head, the Demacia version is going to be favored, assuming that they don't whiff on any Mountain Scryers because of the Demacia cards that they're running. But yeah, it's actually really just that cut and dry. I think it is just anti-aggro. And that's going to do it for my Targon overview. If you're wondering why I didn't upload the last 2 days, it's because I was casting, which is always great, but it does mean that I can't put out YouTube videos because there's physically not enough time in the day. It looks like I will also be reprising that role for the coming weeks, and while it's not going to be Monday and Tuesday, I believe that for the foreseeable future, I will be casting the LBR, that's a Brazilian league, every Monday, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, alongside Shit Just Works on his Twitch channel. Follow me on Twitter from the BLVD, figure out when and where that's happening. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving. Gonna hope to have something up, but honestly I have to work on Tournament Tactician because Friday there's another tournament that I'm casting. There's no fight night this week, so you may have heard that Morpadorp is actually running a Discord server that he runs. It's going to have like a sort of internal tournament run in the Riot format so that you guys can get a look at that. And myself and Shit Just Works will be casting that on Friday. And then coming into the weekend, me and Shit are going to be doing the finals of EU Masters, or rather the entire top cut. And then next weekend is the seasonal tournament. I'm not sure what we have going on that weekend, probably the Online League Series. But once again, follow me on Twitter from the BLVD, figure out when and where I'm casting every weekend, because things have been picking up a lot lately, and I'm getting thrown into a lot of last-minute casts as well. I think I even have a couple of things for the LRA coming up in December, but yeah, definitely follow me there. Hit me up on Discord. I mean, my link tree's down there. You guys can see all my socials. I put it in literally every video. But anyway, that is going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.